Hey everyone, thanks for accessing this webinette here. We wanted to re-record the Navigating Background Checks webinette so you could view it in the VA resource library free of charge. And yeah, we will be offering this session live again in the new year, but for now, we just wanted to offer this presentation through the VA resource library. So without further ado, I'm going to present to you navigating background checks. Okay, so what is VSP? When we say volunteer screening or just screening, we're very broadly describing the process of defining the relationship between volunteers and organizations. Screening is a big topic that encompasses a lot of subtopics, such as the one that we're covering today, but these topics all collectively aim to improve the quality and safety of the programs and services in our communities. The Volunteer Screening Program is a partnership between Volunteer Alberta and the Government of Alberta. It provides educational resources and tools designed to help nonprofit voluntary sector organizations improve their volunteer screening processes and procedures. It offers financial opportunities to aid organizations in their volunteer screening efforts, including the Vulnerable Sector Check Fee Waiver and the Volunteer Screening Development Microgrants. And lastly, please understand, Volunteer Alberta does not provide legal advice. This webinar and our resources will provide some useful general information, but you should bring any concerns specific to your organization and work to a legal professional. To start understanding what to do with a background check, I'd like to start by going over what kinds of information come up in a check and what it means. So, what is a criminal record? Although it seems like a simple question, a criminal record's definition varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, as the kinds of things included in them depend on where the requested background check is being processed. So, to simplify things slightly, we've included the three broad categories of records that could be included in a criminal record according to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. What's important to note in this breakdown is that a criminal record can actually include quite a lot of information that isn't relevant to a conviction or being found guilty of a crime. Sorting through this information can create a lot of administrative work for you as a volunteer engagement professional or volunteer engagement specialist, so keep that in mind. So, the first thing you may see on a criminal record is criminal conviction related information. A person will have criminal conviction if they're sentenced to a term of imprisonment, continuous or intermittent, a fine or forfeiture, meaning property is confiscated by the law, a conditional sentence, where the sentence is to be served in the community with certain rules like house arrest or a curfew, or a suspended sentence with probation, such as rehabilitative supervision in the community through probation. A criminal conviction will remain on an individual's record until the person applies for and receives a record suspension, formerly called a pardon, under the Criminal Records Act. Not all criminal convictions are eligible for a record suspension, though. Something important to know, even about the breakdown of criminal convictions, is that not every kind of conviction info means someone is dangerous or violent. For example, conditional sentences can only be imposed if the person has not been convicted of a serious injury offense, terrorism offense, or criminal organization offense. Similarly, if an offender is found to be a danger to the public, they won't be qualified for a suspended sentence with probation. The next kind of record is non-conviction info where there is finding of guilt. This is primarily known as a discharge. A discharge is an extraordinary sentencing measure that will allow an accused person to avoid a criminal conviction. Notwithstanding the fact that they have either pled guilty to an offense or been found guilty of an offense, um, yeah. An absolute discharge, though, is an immediate discharge from the finding of guilt with no convictions. No criminal conviction will appear on your criminal record after a period of 1 year with an absolute discharge. Within that year, the presence of an absolute discharge will appear on your record, though. A conditional discharge, like an absolute discharge, will require that you admit the facts of the offense, but it also requires that you comply with a set of conditions for a specified period of time. The conditions that accompany this type of discharge may range from 6 months to 2 years. And no criminal conviction will appear on your criminal record after a period of 3 years with a conditional discharge. Within that time, though, the presence of a conditional discharge will appear on your record. And the last category of record that can appear on a background check is non-conviction records with no finding of guilt. There are multiple forms of non-conviction records that can appear in a background check despite not being associated with being found guilty of an offense. As you can see on this slide, there is a host of different records that can appear in a police information check or criminal record check. Things ranging from police contact and surveillance to mental health apprehensions to 911 calls can all appear on a background check. Although it's up to an organization to determine what information is relevant to the role being applied for. This kind of information can be very problematic from a volunteer engagement perspective. The possibility of a volunteer needing to explain potentially irrelevant non-conviction records in the volunteer screening process can be uncomfortable at best and re-traumatizing at worst. Knowing this may be a possibility could dissuade a volunteer from working with your organization, and it's important when you're reviewing background checks to know that not all information that appears in a background check is relevant to the volunteer position being applied for. A really useful tool in determining what kind of information may show up on a police information check specifically is the Alberta Chiefs of Police Disclosure Guidelines. This document is a breakdown of the various conviction and non-conviction related records that the police in Alberta are meant to provide or not provide. It also gives a breakdown of where the information for background checks comes from, proper procedures for receiving police information checks and vulnerable sector checks, or PICs and VSCs as we call them, and some guidance as to how to use PICs and VSCs. The guideline states that the following information does not get disclosed in a PIC. But keep in mind that these guidelines are for police and not RCMP necessarily. So if one of your volunteers is getting their background check from an RCMP detachment, there could be different information you'll need to keep an eye out for. Also, in some communities like Airdrie, they use the RCMP combined with local law enforcement. So it's unclear where the delineation of guidelines falls. Any of the listed records should not appear in a PIC in Alberta, though, including mental health related occurrences under most circumstances, pardon convictions for the most part, unless you're getting a VSC and it's been authorized to be disclosed by the Minister of Public Safety, traffic violations, and suspect information that would compromise an ongoing investigation. Then also any entries in the Canadian Police Information Center marked as special interest to police, information not contained in a police occurrence report, information from foreign law enforcement agencies, most forms of foreign dispositions, and information if the person is a victim, complainant, or witness. With all these guidelines, it's important to note, though, that the disclosure guidelines are not rules. The Auditor General recommends a set of standards for police, but the disclosure guidelines are not actually mentioned in the Alberta policing standards. Therefore, they are just guidelines set out internally, not mandatory rules that all police are obliged to follow. The next thing I'd like to touch on is what to do with physical or digital files when you receive a background check. The first thing to remember is that background check is personal information and must be treated as confidential. Remember, this check is not actually your property, it's the property of the volunteer. According to PIPA, you do need to provide notice for the collection of personal information. For a background check, you need to obtain full informed voluntary consent from the volunteer. Then you may only collect, use, or disclose personal information for the purposes provided in the notice and to the extent reasonable for that purpose. If it's justifiable to request a record check as part of the hiring process, it should be used only for the hiring decision and other consistent employment uses. The results of the record check should be disclosed only to those in the organization who absolutely need to know for approved employment purposes. But you may be wondering, does PIPA actually apply to me or apply here? Well, the answer is yes and no. If an organization is a nonprofit organization, then it depends on how your organization is incorporated to determine whether or not it falls fully under PIPA legislation. Organizations need to determine this. So, for example, trade unions, condo boards, school councils, and churches are subject to PIPA entirely due to the manner in which they're incorporated. If a nonprofit organization is incorporated under the Societies Act or the Agricultural Societies Act, or is registered under Part 9 of the Companies Act, PIPA applies only to the personal information collected, used, and disclosed during commercial activities. This means that if your organization is buying or selling products or services, then PIPA would apply during those activities. Whether an organization is required to follow PIPA or not, the rules of PIPA provide best practices for the care of personal information. Even when not required, nonprofits can voluntarily comply with PIPA. We encourage you to review PIPA legislation and comply with it to the best of your abilities. And we have the slide deck of this presentation available on the Volunteer Alberta website through the VA Resource Library. So you can click through and find this link, but it'll help you kind of determine if your organization falls under PIPA or not. So check out that resource. Oh, and also, it is quite an old resource, just to note, but we did check with the FOIP and PIPA help desk, and apparently it is still up to date. So the following information is pulled directly from the Alberta government's website on PIPA. From PIPA, organizations must develop policies and practices, including those that protect personal information. These policies should be available in writing for an organization to provide to individuals if requested. They should include information about how the organization handles and protects information in its care. For example, and you can see a whole host of information that can be outlined in policies and practices. The information outlines something key to remember about PIPA, though. You are responsible for developing your own policies about handling personal information. The Act outlines some things to consider, but ultimately you need to decide what is reasonable handling and storage of personal information. PIPA also notes limiting the amount of personal information your organization collects in the first place makes security arrangements easier. Security should be appropriate to the level of sensitivity of the information. Destruction of background checks is also something that you can decide on and that we get asked about a lot, but it should be laid out in policy. Think about when you actually need the information provided, which would be the screening process most likely, and what complications would be created if you keep that information for longer than it's actually useful. What kinds of security arrangements do you need to make for long-term storage of background checks? We also get questions on how long a background check is quote unquote good for. But just like the rest of PIPA requirements, there's no standard or blanket approach. You need to think through what makes sense to your organization and put it in a policy. And again, this presentation is going to be available on the Volunteer Alberta website through the VA Resource Library, so you can click through on this link. But the GOA, the Government of Alberta, has a document called Safeguarding Government Information Guide, and it provides some relevant hints and tips towards protecting personal information. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about today is how to interpret a background check and make decisions based on it. The first thing to know is that a background check just says that a result was found. It does not indicate any of the specifics but the circumstances of that result. This is what we want to prepare you for in this section, dealing with the fact that results were found. Based on our surveys, most people have never actually seen a background check that comes back as positive, so they may have some incorrect assumptions of what it contains. So, understanding and thoroughness are key when interpreting a background check. If you see information that comes up on a check that you don't understand, look up what you're seeing or simply ask the volunteer what it might relate to. You should also have a clear written policy establishing what types of offenses are relevant to the specific position and what other factors you will consider if a relevant offense is disclosed on a record check. It could also be a good idea to put your organization's website or volunteer program information documents uh, It could also be a good idea to put on your organization's website or volunteer program information documents that a volunteer should be ready to discuss if anything comes up on a background check, because your organization does not take a blanket approach to background checks and their results. Next up is do not use zero tolerance policies. They are unfair and discriminatory. Even within a certain type of offense, there should be detailed assessments of whether the actual circumstances of the record are sufficiently related to the position to deny the person the volunteer job. There are several jurisdictions in Canada that do not allow for discrimination based on one's criminal records. In these jurisdictions, the onus is on the organization to provide evidence as to why the rejection of somebody for a volunteer or employment role is related to the information revealed on a background check. They can't simply reject anyone for anything on their criminal record. This isn't the case in Alberta, though. Although it's not illegal in Alberta to discriminate in hiring volunteers or employees based on criminal records, we encourage organizations to exercise good faith and consider taking the initiative not to ask for about criminal records unless it's relevant to the volunteer job. So, what does a good policy look like? We talked about policy a lot, so what does it look like? Firstly, a good policy should be based on actual conversations had between staff and or volunteers. In most situations, a policy is meant to be a record of a decision or to come to a decision about what to do when confronted with specific information in a criminal record. Organizations need to have fulsome conversations about risk, liability, and safety to decide on these things. Secondly, a good policy is updated on a regular basis. Try to make sure somebody is available to update your policies every 1 to 2 years. And thirdly, a good background check policy specifically outlines what response is appropriate for different kinds of conviction or non conviction related information. We'd like to use the Boys and Girls Club's Big Brothers Big Sisters Edmonton policy for their service delivery volunteers as an example of a good policy. Um, it's great for interpreting background checks, and as you can see here, it starts with some guidelines on the use of criminal record checks. It outlines that these policies are general in nature, and the organization still looks at circumstances on an individual basis. It outlines what charges they have no tolerance for under any circumstance, and it outlines how this policy applies to youth volunteers. A big thing here is to emphasize that the policy offers the why of the practice, and it shows that it's not an arbitrary decision, which helps future assessments as the organization grows and adapts to community needs. Then the policy starts to get into specifics. As you can see here in the selected sampling from the policy, there are a number of offenses listed, and each one has a time lapse required from when the offense occurred, with some offenses having no tolerance. To be clear, this is different than a zero tolerance policy, which would simply bar anyone from volunteering if anything came up on their record at all. This BGC Bigs policy has a lot more examples, but we just provided a small sampling of them here. And the last thing we'll go over in today's presentation is the position description with pick considerations tool that we have available on the VA's website. A question that should always be front of mind when developing a policy about background check usage is a background check even necessary? We highly encourage you not to use blanket policies that require every volunteer, regardless of their role, to get a background check. Your organization should have volunteer positions that clearly outline what work is being done by which volunteers, and then the organization should make an informed decision about whether or not to get a pick based on the level of risk inherent in the role being discussed. For example, if you are an organization that primarily serves vulnerable populations, but you have some volunteers that strictly do back office administrative work away from clients, you might want to ask yourself if the risk inherent in this admin position is worth getting a background check for. You could be creating unnecessary barriers to volunteer engagement by asking for checks to be done with this kind of volunteer. On the other hand, if they have access to potentially sensitive documents and information, you might want to get a pick and ask yourself what kind of conviction or non conviction related information would be relevant to a role like this. Are there any kinds of records that would bar this person from volunteering with us? And that concludes the presentation. Thanks so much for listening. Thanks for accessing this webinette. Um, and if you are interested in the Vulnerable Sector Check fee waiver or the Volunteer Screening Development microgrants, you can apply on the Volunteer Screening Program website, part of Volunteer Alberta's website. And we offer free coaching to nonprofits in Alberta who are interested in learning more about volunteer screening. So if you'd like to continue this conversation, we also welcome you to get in contact with us. And to offer a little bit more assistance, if you want to access the Do I Need a VSC presentation, which is kind of the sister presentation to this webinette, it's available on the VA website as well. Offers a lot of really good information about how to use a VSC and if you even need one. Yeah, so that's it. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.